Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky seems to have gotten an early Christmas present. President Biden announced the U.S. would provide a $200 million drawdown from the Department of Defense during a meeting with Zelensky in the Oval Office yesterday. Let's listen.
I just signed another $200 million drawdown from the Department of Defense for Ukraine, and that'll be coming quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
While Zelensky seemed happy, the move didn't go over well with everyone. Presidential hopeful RFK Jr. tweeted, "The Pentagon just failed their 6th audit. They use our tax dollars with no remorse or oversight. That stops with me."
And Republicans in both the House and the Senate reiterated their concerns with sending more money to Ukraine unless it's tied to domestic spending. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson told a gathered crowd of reporters that he had not received sufficient clarity from the White House on its Ukraine strategy.
Just had a good meeting with President Zelensky. I reiterated to him that we stand with him and against Putin's brutal invasion. The American people stand for freedom, and they're on the right side of this fight. I have asked the White House since the day that I was handed the gavel as Speaker for clarity. We need a clear articulation of the strategy to allow Ukraine to win. And thus far, their responses have been insufficient. They have not provided us the clarity and the detail that we have requested over and over since literally 24 hours after I was handed the gavel as Speaker of the House.
On the Senate side, Tommy Tuberville from Alabama was even harsher, implying that Ukraine probably never had much of a chance to win in the first place. Let's watch.
Are you concerned that if there's no money, Ukraine could lose the war to Russia?
Well, that's always been a big possibility the whole time. I mean, I've never thought they could win to begin with, especially the way we eased into it.
What are the implications that if Russia wins? Are you worried about the implications if Russia wins?
Well, everybody keeps saying they're going to continue to go across Europe. I mean, they can't beat Ukraine on the eastern side. How are they going to continue to go the rest of the way through Europe? I've never believed that scenario. I think it's a good selling point to send more money.
I mean, Tommy Tuberville is obviously right. Russia is a nuclear power. Ukraine is not. And without the United States being willing to commit to World War III, this was always going to end exactly like this. The fact that we're now allowed to say that out loud without being accused of being a Putin's puppet represents a meaningful shift, but at what cost to the lives of people in Ukraine?
Yeah, and frankly, Speaker Mike Johnson, I thought he said a number of reasonable things there. He said, we stand with Zelensky, with the people of Ukraine. Russia, this was an unjust invasion that Russia shouldn't have done. And I didn't take funding off the table. I just said, explain to us what the strategy is to win this war, and then we could talk about whether we'll be willing to pay for it. And there is no strategy. And in fact, privately, the intelligence officials knew this was probably a doomed effort. They knew exactly what Senator Tuberville is saying there. That was what our own intelligence officials concluded from the get-go. So why are we spending the money then? Which is just prolonging the point at which they're going to reach some kind of negotiation. There'll just be more casualties on both sides of the conflict in the meantime, and more of our money, another $200 million that Biden that's like the rainy day fund. It's already been approved. No wonder, by the way, the Pentagon keeps failing its audits when this is how we do policy. Like, we didn't have Congress. Okay, they already voted on this, and Biden can just spend it how he wants. This is how you get into a place where you can't control government spending. You don't know what's going where. You don't have a coherent national defense strategy. You just have here's some money and have fun with that.
Yeah, I mean, to play devil's advocate, I do think that the U.S. had a strategy. It wasn't a strategy that was aligned with Ukraine's long-term interests, but the stated goal was to weaken Russia. They said that. The stated goal was to weaken Russia. I think what they didn't expect was for Russia to basically persist in the way that it had and to not suffer as many consequences from the isolation that they wanted to impose, that they've been trying to impose both through these military efforts and through sanctions, as they had hoped. The actual consequence of this now almost 2-year conflict has been Russia pulling together with the rest of its allies in the world more closely. You've seen a realignment economically with the growth of the BRICS nations. You've seen a push toward de-dollarization and people moving away from dollar as a currency. And so it's not that Russia has become more increasingly isolated as a consequence of the conflict in Ukraine, is that the United States has become more isolated.
But that was foreseeable, too, that strategy wouldn't work. I always say this, show me the evidence that sanctions dislodge enemy regimes that rarely happens. Our 50-year embargo against Cuba couldn't even dislodge that regime. That was a far stronger sanction-type measures taken. That didn't work to get rid of that government. It immiserates the people of the countries that are targeted by this. It doesn't engender more goodwill toward the U.S. and it doesn't take out their leadership. It fails to do that over and over again. So it's not surprising that yet again that did not work.
Yeah, and props to Tuberville for also calling out there at the end of his statements. He alluded to the fact that the argument that Putin was going to march across Europe was being used as a cudgel to get more funding. That has always been the case up right until last night, where Biden characterized this additional $200 million in additional military aid to Ukraine as, thusly, he said, if you don't give it, it'll be, quote, the greatest Christmas gift to Putin to not continue to provide this funding to Ukraine. And what we're talking about with this $200 million is largely these additional weapons drawdown. So this is from Fox News. It will be taken from Pentagon stockpiles and include additional ammunition for the high mobility artillery rocket. That's the HIMARS system that has been discussed at length in Ukraine. High-speed anti-radiation missiles, anti-armor systems, artillery rounds, missiles, demolition munitions, etc. Now remember when we were having that conversation about cluster bombs over the summer, part of the reason that we were looking the other way as cluster bombs are being used in violation of our global policies because of how destructive they are specifically to children was because we were running low on our own munitions stockpiles, and that was all we have to give. Now we're being told we're sending another $200 million worth of these weapons and equipment from, again, allocations that were made with the intention of defending American safety interests at home and around the world. Now, I have my own critique of U.S. empire and how much we spend on military, but it is very interesting to live in a world where Joe Biden is saying money that was allocated to protect America is going to be written away to send to another country when there's already been ample reporting on our own stockpiles being low. Is this in America's best interest? And who exists in our political system who's willing to push back on this outside of a small number of Republicans?
And if Russia was actually planning to march across Europe, if our European friends and allies really believed that was about to happen, they would be kicking in more money to the Ukrainian war effort, the people who will be subsequently invaded, Germany, France, etc. This has largely been left to the U.S. The U.S. is sending the bulk of support. It's coming from us, which is always the case, where we have to be the world's policeman. If this was an existential threat to Europe itself, if this was the beginning of the Soviet takeover of Europe, I bet they would be more worried about it. They're not. That tells you something.
And you probably wouldn't have to have bombed their pipeline. I don't know who did it, but you probably wouldn't need a pipeline bombing to twist the arm of Germany to get on board with this project.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will continue to follow those developments, and we'll have more Rising right after this.